Wellington. She was not naturally drawn to politics. In fact, in her book, she writes, "I felt no desire to work in Parliament. I had read enough history by then to gather that most of those who dealt in power couldn't help but be corrupted by it." Nonetheless, in 1968, at the request of her old neighbour, she began working in the office of the Leader of the Opposition. She was the first woman in 25 years to be appointed a parliamentary private secretary. And to give you an idea of how that went down, it made the news, and one newspaper headlined the story, "Mr. Kirk's new private secretary, girl next door." Margaret worked closely with Kirk until his death in 1974. Margaret was never a politician, but she was and is a keen observer of politics, and her book, Diary of the Kirk Years, which was published in 1981, remains a compelling record of an enigmatic and complicated leader. Marilyn Waring, some of you may have seen her on this stage yesterday. Marilyn was a National MP from 1975 until 1984. As the new MP for Raglan, she was 22 years old, and she was just one of 4 women in Parliament at that time. Rob Muldoon famously blamed her for causing the 1984 snap election, which of course National lost. And the events of the night Muldoon foolishly and drunkenly called that snap election and all that proceeded to that are brilliantly explained in her latest book, which is The Political Years, Marilyn Waring. Looks like that. And that book essentially picks up where Margaret's book lets off. So it's like kind of lovely rolling chronology. And then we move a little bit forward, quite a bit forward. Lastly, Judith Collins, National MP, Cabinet Minister in the key government and former Leader of the Opposition. Before she entered Parliament, Judith was a successful lawyer and business owner. Her memoir, and I've got a wee thought that this might just be volume 1, is called Pull No Punches, which I guess is the kind of title we might have expected. And of course, Judith's perspective is different again because, not just because she's writing about a more recent time of New Zealand's political history, but also because she's still a sitting MP, so still got skin in the game. Now on that point, I don't know whether any of you came here because you saw a certain story which indicated that we might be in for a bit of a slinging match. I hope you didn't. Well, I hope if you did see that story, that's not why you're here, because we're not going to do that. There's some big themes in all of these books, and as I say, there's a kind of rolling commentary on the way New Zealand was and the way New Zealand has become. Some of the things, some of the history recorded here shows great change and development and advancement, and some of it, which we'll definitely talk about, shows absolutely no change in progress at all. That's what we're here to talk about today. I want to start with a quote from Marilyn's book. And Marilyn, you can respond to this first. You were talking in a radio interview to Sharon Crosby, actually, and you said you now recognise how people become Nazis, looking for simple cliches and someone to blame. As a student, I never understood that ideology in history. I couldn't understand at all how people could respond in such a way in a political environment. It's been quite a tragedy to me that I have seen enough political behaviour across wide spectrums of the New Zealand public to demonstrate to me how this can happen. It's a problem with patriarchy that we are taught that things are male, female, black, white, right, wrong. In politics, the main colour is grey, and it takes most politicians a lot of courage to admit that. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, we'd come through the Springbok tour in that period, and even without social media, you know, half the population was corrupted by propaganda and bullshit. And very much the same kind of lines were attempted for nuclear-free New Zealand. And then, you know, all those years of feminism, so the kind of responses to reproductive freedom, the lack of responses ever to the abuse of women in many, many ways, the collegiality of the patriarchy, making sure we wouldn't ever make progress. And yeah, so it became, you know, like when I was 18, 19, 20, studying political science, I couldn't get my head around how people could become like Nazis. But, you know, what we have to be looking at the moment is the US committee sitting on it, and it's really writ large now. But, you know, in my 20s, I learned how that behaviour could be exposed and espoused.
And, I mean, you mentioned the current, you know, what's happening in the States is a good example of that. But, I mean, the point that you're making, which is this idea that politicians peddle in cliches in the black and the white, don't look for the grey. Why do you think, I mean, I'm going to start from the starting point for me always is that every person who comes to Parliament actually comes for a good purpose. I've never met an MP who didn't come to Parliament with a good purpose in mind. But, oh please, no, a moment of generosity, a moment of generosity.
A large number of those purposes have been about self-promotion. I don't consider that.
Okay, Judith, you're going to agree with me on this.
Yeah, I am actually. The thing is, Linda, a lot of people come into politics and they really value how good they are. And that's one of the problems. And they believe sincerely that if only they could be listened to, the world would be a better place. And that is a bit sad.
Yeah.
But I think generally, I can't think of any politician that I've met in the first 20 years of my political career who doesn't think they're adding value. They all think they are.
I totally agree with that. I mean, if you don't get into the game unless you've got an ego. But that doesn't mean that they're also... I mean, this is actually, dealing in the grey, you're actually capable of holding two thoughts simultaneously, right? One is, I'm shit hot, I'm going to make a difference. But the other is, there's a difference that needs to be made. That's the positive motivation. But I'm still interested, bear with me, you don't agree, but bear with me. If we can assume that people go in there thinking there's a difference that needs to be made, how is it that politicians, generation after generation, fall into the trap of defining the hardest issues that we face in the black and white terms?
It's called elections. And like, even in my era, without social media, loads of people from issue to issue are very lazy, or they want to retain the comfort they have, and they do not want that comfort, whether it's around property rights, whether it's around facing themselves and their abusive characteristics in the mirror, whether it's about sharing central government resources with more people, whether it's about planning for the future as opposed to operating for tomorrow. Because tomorrow is the electoral approach, and the future is I'm here for the good of the country.
Actually, I'll come to you in a minute, Margaret, but Marilyn, lastly on this point with you, one of the amazing things about your book is that you detail conversations that happened in caucus, and we'll come to the ethics of that in a moment. But over and over again in those recorded conversations from caucus, you're talking about big, crunchy, difficult issues, and over again MPs are saying words to the effect of, "This is going to hurt me in my electorate, and I won't win back my seat."
That's how it rocks. So for example, I was in a caucus leading up to election 78, election 81, election 84. I often wasn't in caucus because by then, and besides it was going to be earlier right? I didn't know that at the time, but nonetheless. And what I found was in each electoral year, the provincial margin, the members of parliament who held the provincial marginals had the biggest voice in caucus. They'd just get up and rant about how if we didn't do A, B or C, they'd lose. Now, I'd be very interested to watch the provincial marginals in the Labour Party as we proceed toward the next election. And what's so extraordinary, because this is a MMP versus FPP, first past the post, the provincial marginals are exactly the same electorates as they've always been. The 70s, the 80s, the 90s, it doesn't matter how you redrew them or anything else, they're exactly the same seats. Still holding the country at bay, as it were.
Well, in the Labour Party caucus at the moment, there'd be a whole bunch of people who knew from the day they were elected they were never going to be re-elected because they're never going to get that list vote again. Margaret, let's bring you into it. I mean, you worked in a different time. Yes, it was under first past the post, as was Marilyn's, but you also worked for a very different Prime Minister. The Norm Kirk you describe, it was a bit like Muldoon in the sense that you describe someone who was a loner, he was a bit aloof from his colleagues. He was a man very much who relied on his own instincts. Is that a fair? Have I read that correctly?
Yes, I think so. I would say that, but I have to say this sounds terribly political, but then among both sides of the House, it was far more collegial, I thought. It wasn't really until Robert Muldoon came along that it started to get really, I was going to say a bit vindictive, but you all remember the Moyle affair and various other things that happened. And normally families were never mentioned in Parliament. There was a whole lot that changed during that time. So it was much more collegial. Also, most, because it was men, older men, when I was still white men, for Maori, because it was for Maori seats, most of the men wanted to hold on to their seats because they saw it as a lifetime. And when, I still want to call him Mr. Kirk, I can't get over that, that's shocking at my age. Norman Kirk, when he went in, I think most of his front row was 70. I think one was just on 80. So he brought in a rule, through caucus, of course, saying that when you were 70, you had to resign from the Labour caucus. So then it wasn't like now where people just leave and go on to another career. They just held on.
There's a mythology around Kirk, right? I mean, I don't think that... It's hard to imagine, and maybe that's because politics have changed, but it's hard to imagine any leader having a sort of mythological legacy in the way that Kirk has. How was that, how did that begin?
Well, he himself, I thought that he would be so shocked if he'd been at his own funeral, because he really thought that no one particularly liked him. He had no idea that he was as popular as he was. How did the myth start? I think really because in the sort of 18 to 20 months he was alive, he did take some big steps. You can think immediately of anti-nuclear, you can think of the Springbok tour counselling that, but there was lots of other things, believe it or not, like improving the status of women, and really, that was what he was trying to do. Now, there was big problems, particularly if you remember with the oil shocks, all sorts of things happened. But I think it was because these things were done, they were done in a short time, and they were done very clearly. It was clearly put to the people what was happening, and I think people wanted that after years of Hollyoake, which was sort of steady as she goes.
So initially, well, the original plan was you were going to write this book with him.
That's right, when he retired sometime in the future.
And so you were clearly keeping the diary, because that's what it is.
Yes.
And he was giving you information for the diary.
Yes, yes. Well, there was letters that would come through, and he'd say, I think you better keep a copy of that. So that was good. And I was making my own notes. A lot of them were my own notes, not his. But if there was anything particularly important, he might say, come into the office. If there was a press, and a really interesting gathering of the press, and he had something important to say, he'd come and sit and listen to this. So I really felt quite privileged over that.
And Marilyn, you were clearly keeping a diary. Or, I mean, you left Parliament with hundreds and hundreds of pages of documentation. Look at that face, honestly. Between your grin and your eyebrow raise, I feel like they've got the blandest face in the country at the moment. But go on, off you go.
Okay, well, look, if you read the book, you'll find it was really an accident that I got there, because it was International Women's Year, and I joined the Women's Electoral Lobby, and they'd written to all of the executive directors of the parties, asking them why they didn't select more women, and it was almost like the boys had gathered at the Gestetner and shared the letter, because they all said, well, of course, we'd love more women if only they'd offer themselves. So the Women's Electoral Lobby, remember, there was Margaret Shields, Fran Wild, Sonia, a whole group, Marika Robinson. So a number of us just thought, oh, all right, for the hell of it, we'll prove that wrong, right? We'll put ourselves forward. And truly, 22-year-old in the third safest national rural constituency in the entire country, how was that ever going to happen? I thought I was quite safe, really. But anyway, it did. And then I never thought I'd last. And a man called Jim Trowie rang up and made an appointment to see me, and he came in and he introduced himself as the current chief librarian at the Alexander Turnbull Library. And he said, well, we don't collect many politicians' papers, but we've had a discussion and we think yours might be going to be interesting. So could you sign this piece of paper? And at the end of every year, we'll just come and clean out the files you tell us to clean out, and off they trickled over to be put in cold storage. It really is cool down there, in the Turnbull Library. So they were all being secured, and then I wrote notes all the time. I can remember Brian Talboys even saying to me, are you writing down what's going on in caucus? And I was as close, I used to sit directly in front of Muldoon in caucus so he could never look straight ahead. And I would always laugh that his legs never hit the ground. And when he got excited, they used to move, And I'd start going like this too, you see. So, look, there were loads, I said to Brian Talboys, no, I'm just making notes. But that's not true. I was taking down nearly every word.
Even though the rules were you weren't to take notes.
Yeah, but there were only
rules.
No, but they weren't written rules anywhere. They were just, we didn't do that. And besides, if you've been in a National Party caucus, the rule is that you are always entitled to go to the Turnbull and access the minutes. But Hugh Templeton was the minute keeper, and he was lazy, and he'd get distracted, and he'd talk, and he wouldn't write things down. So I had a better record than anybody. So that's, that's what I did. And I thought to myself, and the other thing that was really important was whenever I travelled, every 3 days I would write back to my constituency, and it would be circulated through every office holder. And I would write exactly what I'd been doing and what it was about, and I'd forgotten I'd done that. And then I found them in the archives when I was writing the book, and they became a really substantial part of the book. So thanks to Jim Trowie, really, and that wander across the road and having me sign they would take everything. So much of it was already taken care of. It's just that I then had to go through 200 to 300 boxes to write the book.
Quite a distillation. Judith, do you keep a diary?
I keep diaries at various times. So,
you mean when the shit hits the fan?
no, actually, even before that. And it always does. Because if you go into politics and think that you're there just to make up the numbers, then you shouldn't go into politics, in my opinion. So I've kept diaries over the years, but also I keep records, I keep all sorts of information, and I'm a lawyer, so any lawyer who doesn't keep records is not going to stay long.
So
And
do you ever
that's what I
take notes in caucus?
No, I never have to. I've never had to say what's happened in caucus, and if I take notes, it's like things like go and do X or something. I'm supposed to do something,
Yeah.
so I don't, and I'm very careful not to. But the great thing is, there's obviously so much connection between some people who obviously media seem to have all sorts of information out of caucus things, and I always keep all the media reports on anything basically, and so I can go back and say what's happened on certain days because there'll be a media report about it. So and it ain't me who does it.
Do you know who it is?
No, I think it's various people over the years have done things. I remember, well, in my book I spoke about, you might all remember there was once an MP called Brian Connell. You don't remember, do you? No. And there we go. But he obviously was accused at one stage of leaking out a caucus about something that happened with Dr. Don Brash. And, those sorts of things. He's no longer an MP. He wasn't straight after that. So it's like we just don't ever. I never do. And since I'm often someone who's stood up against whatever I'm being told I have to do, I'm always very careful to be very, about those sorts of things.
I can actually say that some of the worst leakers in the National Party caucus went on to become very senior cabinet ministers.
Yes, I understand.
Some of those people used to be my best friends, but there we are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I know.
Marilyn, there's another quote in your book, which is a quote actually from Salman Rushdie. He says, "We live in an age in which the people who control history, who control reality, are increasingly telling lies about it. Politicians have understood it. In order to control the future, it is necessary to control the past, and it is the people who control the memories of nations that control its destiny." Margaret, your diary, that was kind of a way of controlling the destiny of the Norm Kirk myth, wasn't it?
Not really. No, I never thought about that at the time. I just wanted to do what I'd seen it happen. So really it was a day-to-day record. But by the way, I should tell you that my publisher, Chris Cole-Catley, some of you will have known how wonderful she was. She was a great enthusiast. So when I would do a chapter, she'd want more. So it was it was over 6 books long by the time I finished. So I kept saying to her, we can't go on. And she said, we could let it go in little episodes, which was impossible. So we had to cut it right down. And then finally, the final draft was cutting 11, this is when you've got your page, proof, 11 lines out of each page. So everything was really reduced. But I think it still reads quite well. And because of that, I really didn't, it may give that impression, but I didn't think it was. I thought it was just saying what I'd seen. And it was really quite different to what I expected.
I think it's a fantastic book, and I really recommend it. But I think it says some of what you've seen, and I want to point you to this. So this is the publisher's note. I don't normally read publisher's notes in books, I've got to say, but this one just looked so, I don't know, it just drew your attention. It says, "This book is as explicit as the law allows it to be. The reader will sometimes have to be alert to the heavy silences which hang between the lines."
Well, a lot of the lines were cut out, but it was mainly because of medical misadventure. There was quite a lot that went on there, and at the time it couldn't really, well, publishers were very worried about such things, even if there was quite a lot of evidence, and that was one of the reasons.
Is that all? Anything else left out?
Well, there was a few other things, but mainly it was because of the doctors, because he had a particular doctor, and yes, Well, at least 3 professors of medicine rang me and said, get him away from that doctor. And there was various things like that. So it didn't help. There were a few other things as well, but those certain things couldn't be put because of the doctors and the families.
And speaking of heavy silences, there's a lot of heavy silence in your book.
Yes, but there's a few messages in there, and some of the people who would know that what those silences are have got that message, because it's just enough in there that they know that I know. And that's perfectly fine. My book obviously was subject to quite a lot of
I bet.
looking at. And the good thing is that I was able to go back with answers on everything. But there are
Tell
few
us about the
things
conversation with John Key, where he
Which one?
says, well, there's one in the book where he's basically telling you to resign.
Oh, the 6:30 a.m. thing on a Saturday
Yeah, and he
morning.
says, I'll just give you a little flick.
Yeah. Yeah, that was interesting. This is the one where you said you have to go now or
Yeah.
something. Yeah, okay.
So this was after the Orovida.
Oh, yeah. That
Then there was the SFO.
No, no, this was the SFO thing.
Yeah,
this was
that's
the accusation, entirely false, that I had worked against the SFO chief executive. It was totally defamatory and wrong. And somebody had sent him something to say that this had happened, some email that someone sent someone else. For God's sake, you know.
But actually, Key wasn't interested in whether it was true or not, was he?
Gutless decision, and it is not one that I would have made. And the reason is, you see, that's the difference. See, I'm not ruthless enough. And he was. No, he was absolutely ruthless. His job was to get the National Party over the line and get into government, and the population would have thought that was a great idea. Or a lot of the population, possibly not many here, but a lot of people, a lot around the country did. And so someone had to be sacrificed, and that was it. And my point was, if you're going to sack one of your better performing ministers on the basis of an email from one person to another person claiming something with no actual evidence, and the State Services Commission has come out and said, what are you talking about? She was always helping this chief executive. There's something wrong here. Then actually that just showed that he was and is significantly more ruthless than me. See, I couldn't do that.
It's quite a good example, though, and I think you kind of
It's
referred
the difference
to
between being the person who would be the Prime Minister and was the Prime Minister, and someone like me who would go and see all the grey.
Do you think you see the grey?
Yeah, all the time. And that's one of the problems, you see. So it's easy to go, you're talking about, black and white. Okay, come back to media, Linda. Seriously? Try and get the grey
Hey, mate,
through.
don't look at me.
Try and get through grey in media, in the mainstream media or in political, in the parliamentary gallery. The answer is, people want short, sharp things. You look on the online of the mainstream media now, and what do you see in your headlines? Anything that actually inspires you, that there is a long discussion about things with both sides put there. Things are either good or bad so often now, and we know that, and it becomes advertising clickbait.
Well, it's reported as a sport in a sense.
It is.
Winners,
now
losers.
Sport. Winners, losers, useless, good, and also what I find concerning over the years is the way in which, if I and you do not agree on a matter, that does not make you a bad person or me a bad person. It means we don't agree on an issue. And, as lawyers, you're used to, when you're dealing with matters, you always have your client's position that you are promoting. Whether you agree with your client or not, you have to do that. And it's a lot like that in politics. You have a party position. If you don't like that, you end up either trying to change the mind of the party, or else you have to subjugate yourself to it, or else you go, or else you do what Marilyn did, which was to make a very firm stand on it, and therefore then leave. That's what happens.
There's actually a huge difference between the politics or the discipline on MPs from your time to yours.
Totally
And Marilyn, if we go back to your book, I mean, there's a one there's one piece of legislation you talk about. I think it's the introduction of youth rates. It was a piece of legislation in which the introduction of youth rates was part of it. You crossed the floor 18 times. Now, you just couldn't. That just couldn't happen today.
It would never happen today. You'd be out.
But because I'd been a political science student, right, I knew that the National Party constitution was all about liberty and freedom, right, and had no rules at all or restrictions if you were representing your constituency. If I became a Labour Party candidate, I signed Rule 242 of the Labour Party constitution that said at all times and on all occasions I would vote in accordance with the majority of the caucus. Now, very early on my feet in the House, I started to espouse this, and totally strategically, so that a whole lot of my colleagues who weren't thinking deeply at the time took it on board as well, right? So that then when I said no, we've got no Rule 242 here, they'd stymied themselves. But you got punished every time, really punished for it. So, the youth rate one was, I think, the only time I crossed where we actually won, because Mike Minogue came with me. But I can't remember how many times finally it was. But that's how really early as a member, I set that up as a look how good we are, we don't do that.
But equally, you were doing interviews right through your time as a MP, but certainly in the last term, a lot of these interviews, and a lot of them are quoted in the book, where you're openly criticising your party's position on certain things. You're challenging the Prime Minister of the time. And that really made me reflect on when I went to Parliament as a political reporter in the late 80s for the first time, but then I went back right through the 90s, that there was a real shift during that period between when you could interview someone on the record and they would openly debate the issue, and where we've got to today, where, as you describe, it's the collective responsibility of Cabinet has gone right through now, and no one's able to say, actually, we don't think that's a great idea.
I think you're quite right, Linda, and I think possibly, I wasn't there at the time, but I've got this feeling it may have something to do with the MMP era and the way in which party lists and things like that have...
And Helen Clark's management, I think.
Possibly as well, and it's come to that sort of stage where people get rated by a listing committee which the leader of the party actually ends up controlling, to be frank, It's not really quite what people think. But it's also where there's plenty of other people who can take your place. You look at Louisa Wall, for instance. The way she has had to basically leave Parliament. Could I see Louisa coming over to our side to come and support us or something? Not in 100 years. But... is not seen to be part of the team as much as you need to be. And politics has become very much that team thing. And I think in Marilyn's day, every MP was an electorate MP who had their electorate and who we represent. And that is different now. So we have electorate MPs like myself, but we also have list MPs who are entirely there because the party hierarchy, whichever form it takes, has decided that they can be there and they can take that away whenever they wish to at the next election, and it will be done.
But also the selections change, don't you think?
Yeah,
for
totally.
all the fact that, we look back on your career and with just so much admiration for your independence and the intellect you brought to it. But would you actually be selected these days as a candidate?
No, because National Party would make sure that all those kind of people with independent minds are ruled out at candidate training school. And I sat on an aeroplane to Sydney with a woman who not long ago was the president of the National Party, and she was 2 seats away, and I could hear her talking National Party stuff. And it was fun because I realised she didn't recognise me. And so I said to her, oh, well, when's the National Party going to get some people like Ian Shearer or Mike Minogue back again? Oh, God, no, we get rid of them in candidates training school. You know, but the other thing that you
I think
have
we've
to-
all worked out who she's talking about now.
They didn't have it in my day, by the way.
Yeah, that's right.
But, you know, I think polling in Raglan and Waipā, there might have been 21,000 votes cast. 4,000 people belonged to the National Party when I was the MP. 4,000 already, right? And in that 82-84 period, they loathed Muldoon. And I was representing my constituency, right? And it was just too bad. The other thing that I always said over those years is, I'm so much younger than all of you, and I'm going to have to live with what I do here for much longer than any of you are ever going to have to live with it. And so I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror for the rest of my life.
I want to shift gears because I want to talk about another theme before we go to your questions. So if you've got some questions, start thinking of ways that you'll be able to articulate those briefly. Reading, because Marilyn's book is structured as a series of, each chapter's a year that she was in Parliament, and it is a kind of, in some ways it's a stream of consciousness of things that she did on each kind of month during that period of time. So there are pages where it kind of lists the subjects that were the matter of caucus discussion. These pages are really sobering because you read them and they list off a whole lot of things like rising inflation, cost of living problems, rising inequality, problems with the healthcare access, gangs, and you literally could be thinking to yourself, as I was, this is exactly what Labour's caucus is going to be discussing this week and National's caucus is going to be discussing this week. And it made me wonder and ask the question whether or not those big problems that we know this country has faced and still faces cannot be solved by the Parliament in the way that it's structured today. Judith.
Oh, thanks, Linda. Now, that is called a hospital pass. And about now I get tackled by John Alomu. I think it's unwise for us to think that politics solves problems. I think it is important to remember that we are a house